So also a welcome now, additionally, to all those who are viewing us later on. As I said, the framework is the reason of this meeting today. We'd like to share with you all what we did and above all the result of the work we've done to work on finding common language on what we see as responsible purchasing practices, because we think having this common language is very useful for further industry alignment, and we hope that that will also help to have a bigger impact, which is, I guess, the shared goal of all of us here in this meeting today. So the purpose of this meeting is to explain you a bit more about the context and the process for how we got to the text that we have shared also with you, so that you know better the context on how to provide feedback on it. It is a lot of work that we've done in the past 1.5 years with a group of MSIs, with several organizations contributing to it. And we hope that not only us as MSIs will start to use and refer to this common language, but also everyone else embracing it and integrating it into their own practices. And that will, of course, be a different process for each and every organization, depending on the structure and the way they work. We expect a full version release, so to say, after the consultation period. We will talk a bit about that later. And then with the group of MSIs who started this work, we're also keen to further discuss how we can incentivize the uptake of this common framework and how to measure progress. So that is still to come, so that there might be some questions on that process as well. That is then still in the pipeline, so not the purpose of this meeting. For this meeting, we'd really like to focus on the text and the content of the framework and the process for providing feedback. So let's get started. It is all about purchasing practices, of course. And there is a clear link. I think all of us here in this call would be clear on the fact that there is a clear link between purchasing practices of the brands on one end of the supply chain and working conditions at the other end of the supply chain. There is different research confirming that, research of ILO, of ETI, fair wear, better buying. And I think there's also enough international frameworks to help us think about this. So we have reference to the relevance of purchasing practices in our international guidelines as the United Nations Guiding Principles, the OECD guidelines for multinational enterprises, and also the subsequent OECD due diligence guidance, specifically for the garment sector and for others. So there is a clear link. For brands doing their due diligence, you also have to review your purchasing practice to see how they impact negatively, possibly working conditions at the other end of the supply chain. And you do have to engage with suppliers. So actually the topic of purchasing practices and the relevance of it is not new. We are already, as MSIs, as brands, as governments, talking a lot of years about how to improve purchasing practices, about the fact that brands have to adapt purchasing practices, about how to find the right incentives to promote responsible purchasing practices. But actually we saw that there's not enough uptake of it yet. But also, of course, last year with the COVID outbreak, we were clearly given this spotlight on the fact that poor purchasing practices, even for some brands who have committed earlier on to responsible purchasing practices, can have a massive negatively impact on the life of workers. So we thought actually it is important to make sure that everybody has a proper understanding, not only of the fact that purchasing practices are relevant, but also what aspects of purchasing practices are relevant. What is actually good, responsible behavior for purchasing, for brands when they do their purchasing. So we felt there was a need for more clarity, more unified messaging towards the industry. So actually to look for what we call a common language, because that would facilitate us and others looking for more alignment and hence have also more impact together. So we started as a group of MSIs when those moments were still there, that we were gathering live at the OECD conferences. On March of the OECD conference, we had since a couple of years the habit of coming together as MSIs. And we said, well, why don't we set up a working group to further discuss this and to further work on finding the right wording, understanding, agreeing on the same understanding of the different purchasing practices and how they could be made more responsible. So we wanted to gain alignment for ourselves to make sure that we use the same language internally. We also wanted to find alignment to make sure that we support our brands with the same language, to harmonize our approaches, to harmonize our training material, and to in that sense, also to find alignment, to also use this towards other industry actors and to see how to better incentivize brands to a better uptake of changing purchasing practices. So it's not only for us as MSIs, we really wanted to look for a common language for the industry. So who is involved in this whole process? I have mentioned a couple of times, it's a group of MSIs. So we've worked together with this with Ethical Trading Initiative, Ethical Trade Norway, the Danish Ethical Trading Initiative, us as Fairware, the German Partnership for Sustainable Textiles, the Dutch Agreement for Sustainable Garments. And we've had throughout the process support of Better Buying Institute and also ILO Better Work has participated actively in the working group to consult with us, and we've consulted also with ACT, and Amfori has also contributed to the discussions in the working group. So it's a large group of organizations. Several of them are here also in this meeting today. Maybe some of you can switch on your cameras to show who you are, so that people know also who has been involved in this process. There we have Juliette, there we have Kirsten from the Textielbündnis. I see Fleur from AGT, me from ETI. She has a bit challenges with her camera, so she will switch off in a bit, but good to see you, Marta from ETI Norway. So it's been a nice group to work with, and we've had very good and intensive discussions. So what is the process that we foresee for this, for the work? We have started to work on this first draft of the framework by mapping out a lot of different resources. And we already in the beginning agreed that we would then include this step that we are engaging on now to have this stakeholder consultation opportunity. So we'd like to hear from you, to hear your perspectives on what you think of the result of our work. Next to that, also since the beginning, we already agreed that we'd like to set up a learning and implementation community, a kind of safe space, a kind of incubator, maybe even for a group of brands to start implementing the different principles of what we've come up with, not only to learn together, but also to have a good check on feasibility and maybe delivers also important information on how we can measure progress later on. So once there is a finalized version of the framework after the first stakeholder consultation process, we of course want to share it as wide as possible and stimulate the use of it and stimulate the uptake or the implementation of it. So when starting this work, we knew, as I said in the beginning, a lot of people are already for years talking about purchasing practices. So there was quite some information available. Of course, the different documents that we use or the different systems that we use as MSIs within our own organizations. So we've looked at the joint ETI's guide to buying responsibly, our own Fairware's work on the brand performance check. We've also looked at ACTS system, but also looked at other documentation, like, for example, the New York Stern's social metrics for the apparel industry and the American Bar Association's Responsible Purchasing Code of Conduct, and the work they've done to define clauses, and also the work of Better Buying Institute, of course, who's one of the partners that has been engaged in the whole process. We started with this 1.5 years ago, and throughout the last month of this year, so to say, there was, of course, a discussion coming up within the group of suppliers now gathered together in the Sustainable Terms of Trading initiative that have come out with a white paper. So that is a really relevant document for us and a really relevant stakeholder for us to engage with. So what we've tried, as the timing was actually quite nice, we were almost at the end, we've been able to also incorporate most of the recommendations that they have raised in their white paper. And we found that a very important step to do to make sure this is, in the end, the framework that the whole industry can embrace. So the first thing, of course, that we did is defining what we see as purchasing practices. There's, I mentioned some research at the beginning showing the relation between things happening in the supply chain and the different aspects of purchasing practices. So which of the aspects of purchasing practices are we looking at? Design, planning and forecasting, critical path management, contracts, technical specification, order placement and lead times, price and cost negotiations. The payment terms is an obvious one, and also underlying behaviors, values, and principles of how it is integrated within a company. So this means that we have, others might see it as maybe a limited definition of what responsible behavior of brands is. So the framework is really about the purchasing practices. That doesn't mean that we as MSI Group are not looking into other responsible behavior aspects, like contributing to remediation, for example, like properly doing your due diligence process and reporting on it. So those are also valuable aspects of and the models of a brand that are taken into consideration when looking at sustainability. But for this specific framework, we've looked at purchasing practices, sourcing practices. So this is what we have come up with. 5 key principles. The first one is on integration and reporting, because we really feel it is important that the brand not only says it's taking seriously its own role and responsibility, but really integrates it into the different departments, and that the different people also can live up to it, because it might be not a new thing to say to you that different people within the organization, of course, can have an effect on working condition, whether it's the salesperson or the design person, or they all can have an impact. So integration and reporting is very important. Equal partnership is maybe the main thing that covers it all. We want to move with those 5 principles towards a new relation between buyers and suppliers, a new, if you want to call it, a new sourcing dialogue. And that sourcing dialogue should enable improved social dialogue as well. It should take away some obstacles that are currently hindering social dialogue. And we hope that this new partnership will also facilitate, of course, reducing the negative impact of purchasing practices, and at the same time creating space for manufacturers to really implement the practices according to the labor standards. Collaborative production planning is an important key principle, fair payment terms, of course, and sustainable costing to also allow the sufficient margin for living up to human rights and labor rights. So those 5 principles are at the heart of the common framework. And for each of them, we have tried to make a specification to make sure we have a really similar understanding of what they mean. So you can see here in the example for the principle on equal partnership, we have identified a couple of groundwork practices and a couple of progress practices. We've had long discussions within the group whether we should go for a staged approach or and then maybe the framework leans a bit more towards guidance on how to go about it and give room for brands to grow into it, so to say. But at the same time, we've said, well, no, there is also a minimum level that one should see as a definition of those practices. So that's why we came up with, in the end, groundwork practices and progress practices. This is a bit about the whole process of the common framework getting together. I said in the beginning, we've done this work with a working group of different MSIs. So it is a nice moment to also hear from some of the others how they see the added value of the work of the working group and of the common framework. So maybe first the floor to me from ETI. Can you share your perspective on this?
Sure, absolutely. Thank you so much. And hi, everyone. I'm very sorry not to turn on my camera. I'm having issues with my home internet today. And then I'm also now having issues with not being able to turn on my camera without my sound dropping. So can you hear me all right? Perfect.
Yes,
thank
you.
you.
Can.
Great. I clearly need to upgrade my technology, but that's next step. So for those that don't already know me, my name is Mika Lande. I'm ETI's program manager for the Stitch program. I've also been one of the ETI staff who has been a part of developing this framework over the last year or so. So thank you for inviting me to share a few thoughts from ETI side. So firstly, as our members would already know, ETI has made a commitment within its 5-year strategy to focus on business practices. Developing and providing guidance for businesses is one of the approaches we will be taking under this area of work. So since we released the JETI Guide to Buying Responsibly a few years back, we have seen a great improvement in the way that members approach this issue. And there is definitely an appetite to explore purchasing practices more. So as purchasing practices is now a priority for many members, this framework will be a great tool to enable them to take that next step in this area. One of the main positives about this framework is that it does bridge the gap between buying practices and supplier autonomy. This is also a huge opportunity for peer-to-peer learning. I personally feel that this is a very exciting framework, and I can't wait to speak to members about piloting it in different business models specifically. I think that this framework, combined with ETI's wider aim to facilitate an engagement with senior brand management, will without a doubt drive positive change both for workers in global supply chains, but also it will also lead to long-term positive business outcomes. And finally, from a wider perspective, a common framework and being a part of a wider working group really provides an opportunity to create alignment across a number of other organizations who are also working in this space. So hopefully doing this collectively will ultimately drive change on a much larger scale. I think that's all from me. Thanks again.
Thanks a lot, Mi. And that is what we do it for, of course, to have in the end a bigger impact. Tamar, can you share some thoughts for the AGT?
Yeah, I can. Hi everyone, my name is Tamar Hoek. I work for Solidaridad and I'm part of the steering committee of the Dutch Agreement for Sustainable Garment and Textiles. I cannot really take credit for working on this agreement because I recently took over from Fleur, but Fleur actually did all the work. Maybe some of you know that the Dutch agreement is ending by the end of this year, and we decided that Solidaridad, so me for Solidaridad and Nienke Steen from Modint, will take over the work that Fleur did so that the brands that are part of the AGT can still participate or work with the framework. The Dutch agreement decided to join the initiative because it's a very important topic. It's very relevant for companies, and we actually need such an aligned framework. I think in the last few years within the AGT, purchasing practices has been high on the agenda. So there were several trainings organized for brands. The tools of ACT, so the purchasing practices self-assessment tool, could be used. It was also possible to work with better buying. So we feel that while the brands just started with the work, it's important that it can continue. As Solidaridad, I think I want to add that there are so many different tools and frameworks and standards out there that the need for alignment and convergence is high. And I think Margrethe already mentioned like harmonization, alignment. I think that are the key words with regards to purchasing practices. I think we need to avoid duplication. We need to keep it manageable for facilities and brands, but also make sure that all the tools and frameworks are effective and work towards improvements. And for that, we need to kind of have at least a common understanding of what responsible purchasing practices are and how they can impact the situation at a facility level. As I said, the AGT is ending by the end of the year, but Nienke and myself will coordinate the feedback process, but also can support several companies, the AGT companies, with further strengthening their purchasing practices. And we will also be participating in the testing of the framework also after the AGT has ended. So maybe some of you know there's a negotiation process now towards a next generation agreement, which is hopefully a continuation of the Dutch agreement. And we would like, or at least we focus now on including this framework within this agreement, so that in the overlap time in between, AGT brands can still reach out to us so we can support you and keep you in the loop with regards to this important work. I will keep it at that, Margrethe.
Thanks a lot, Tamar. And that is really good to hear. Next to those organizations, also the Partnership for Sustainable Textiles, the textile business has been a very active part, and I'd like to hand over now to Topsy, who will take you through the process for feedback, the reason of the meeting of today.
Thank you, Margaret. Yeah, as representing the German Partnership for Sustainable Textiles here, and also being part of the MSI working group, who and is working with textile companies to uphold their responsibilities on due diligence along the supply chain. We are also really happy this current version is launched, and we are looking forward also in the partnership how we can use and implement the framework in the future. And now I would like to elaborate a little bit more on the process of the consultation and how you can actually provide your feedback. We really welcome you and invite you to give your feedback on the content and the text of the framework that you can find on the website, that you can see on the next slide. There you will also find the terms of reference, the terms of reference document that provides you with further information on the process and the limitations we face and the possibilities you have. In this section on the website of the Industry We Want website that you can see here, you will find a designed survey that you can use to provide your feedback. We would like to remind you that only one survey should be submitted for each organization, and would also encourage you to read the full draft of the framework really carefully before you start the survey. There will be some more general questions on each of the 5 principles, but you will also be able to give more detailed feedback on the practices provided under each of the principles. Yeah, and we would also like you to remind you to be as precise as possible so we can integrate your feedback in the best way. The consultation will be open until January 14th next year, so you have enough time to read and comment carefully, and the feedback afterwards will be evaluated and where appropriate integrated into an improved version of the framework. Of course, your feedback will be treated anonymously, and it will not be shared with any third party outside the working group. That is really important for us, so you can be in a safe space and be really honest with us. A public document will afterwards be released, and it will summarize how your feedback was dealt with and how the working group is responding to this feedback. Some more words on the learning group and implementation community. we decided to form a learning and implementation community that will pilot the framework in 2022. The group of companies and experts who are committed to implement and learn from shared experience will try and implement the framework in practice. This should help to validate the framework if it's workable in practice, and if the different stakeholder groups involved can really agree with how the framework has been written, and if the working group can really implement it. The working group is also open to amending the framework based on learnings and outcomes that will be shared within the working group. And the experiences that will be made will also be fed back to the wider audience. We will come together in different meetings along the year, and we will join in different groups and try to learn from the practice that we try to make. Thank you so much, and I will give back to Margriet now.
Thanks, Topsy. It is also shown in this figure that we indeed hope that with such a learning and implementation community, we will also kind of harvest information, tools that brands can use for the implementation office, and maybe also typically information on how to improve the measurement of progress. So what we want to do, of course, with the framework once it's final is to use it and share it as widely as possible. Because as said, the whole reason why we embarked on this journey is to work towards alignment and to create a bigger impact. So there's different ways how you can go about the framework. So we hope that next to the organizations that have worked on this, the MSIs, that also others will embrace the framework and implement it into their own structures. So that will mean if you are talking about purchasing practices within your organization, in training material, for example, that you update and refer to the framework and that you update the wording, also update the guidance that you provide to your brand. So to integrate it in your own systems. And for us, for example, as Fair Wear Foundation, where we also have a system to assess performance of brands, we will then also include it, integrate it into the brand performance check system. So that will be for each organization an own process that fits the purposes of their organization. Next to that, we as a group of MSIs are also keen to together, once the framework is final, to discuss how we can ensure incentives are there to enhance the uptake of it. So to discuss what those incentives can look like, is that to discuss with legislators, policymakers, finance sector, retailers. And that is, of course, also a discussion that we'd like to do with important stakeholders in the industry. So something to discuss also in our dialogue with, for example, the Sustainable Terms of Trading Initiative, or to connect with what the industry we want is doing in relation to purchasing practices, or connect with the discussions taking place at the OECD forum. So we really see this as a step to come to common language in order to facilitate alignment on purchasing practices, also to facilitate cooperation among brands and different stakeholders. So we have luckily enough room for some questions as well. We have a great number of participations, so let's see how we can best organize this. There is an option in the reaction button to raise your hand, or you can maybe address your questions in the chat if you like. So let's see if there are any questions on either the process of having having arrived at this text, at this framework, or about the consultation process. Then please raise your hand or add a question in the chat. You have all received the full framework. So we advise you to read it properly in all details before you start to the clicking on the link of the survey. I see a raised hand. Natasha, the floor is yours.
Hi there. Yes, thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, we can.
Yeah, I had a couple of questions. One practical one was around the survey and whether it's possible to download a kind of copy of it if, as an organisation, you're going to work on it and make one submission. Is there any way that we can kind of have a look at the full survey to then work on it as a team before we submit the final response? And then a second question was around the companies that you're looking to have or have that are going to be piloting it. I was just wondering whether that's something that you're still working on, or if anyone signed up to do that, and if that's going to be something that you kind of disclose to this group or to a wider audience, which companies are signing up to do that. And then a final question was around measuring the sort of impact of this framework and the feedback loop around engaging suppliers to know how it is actually working in practice and whether that's something that's been developed or just how that's going to be kind of measured. Yeah,
clear. Thanks a lot. So let's start with the first one, the practical question, whether it is possible to download the survey. I'm looking at my colleagues who have worked on the Survey Monkey to see whether that is a practical opportunity. Milena?
Yeah, hello. So it is not possible, but the way you could do it is you access it online and you just click through the survey without submitting it. And then you can have a look at the different questions and then come back at some point and answer all of them. But then again, also, if it's helpful for you, we could devise a document with all the questions and also put it on the website. So you could quickly, in one document, have all the questions. So that is not a problem.
I think that's an excellent suggestion. I think we should do that.
Yeah.
And the way the survey is structured is that it goes per principle and asks you basically what you think of the principle, and then if you would like to add some further feedback on the further specifications of the different practices of the principle, there's an opportunity to provide text suggestions. So what you could do with your group is to first discuss the framework as is in the document that was shared with you, and then with the discussion that you've had with the group to go to the online survey. Then about the question for the learning community, the subgroup of the working group is currently discussing the terms of reference for the learning community and the steps that we will take. Is I think the idea that we will work with a number of brands for a period with different meetings, but also with some mentoring on it, with brands also committing to make steps. So it will not be a session where brands can just listen in and get information. They're really asked to actively participate and to learn by doing and also by sharing their learnings with the others. So it's a peer learning process. But as mentioned, the terms of reference are still being prepared. And once that is done, we will make we will share that information and also open the community up for brands to let us know whether they're interested. So if you, as a brand already, are keen on hearing more, you can already address your interest or share your interest with the email address that is included in the full framework document, so that we can take this into consideration and share the information when it's there.
Can I add one point on that? Part of the question was have we already got companies signed up? And as yet, we don't have agreed list of companies signed up, but when we do have companies signed up and when we start it kind of in the first quarter or first half of next year, I do think that the list of companies will be public. It will be a group that people join, and but we don't know the list of companies yet, just to answer that specific part.
Yeah, so that is still to come. And then the measuring the impact, of course, a very relevant question. As I indicated indeed, so far the group has really worked on focusing on getting the definitions right, on getting the common framework right, and ensuring that we have a common understanding of what responsible purchasing practices are. We do now the stakeholder feedback round, so there might be some things that we might still want to tweak or to improve still, to make sure it is a framework that can count on the support, on the wide support of the industry. And the stakeholder feedback is, of course, used to see where we can improve the framework. We're not keen on watering it down, of course, as we are happy with the baseline that we have set so far. And then we will indeed look, as I said, with the group of MSIs, how we can discuss incentives to further enhance the uptake of the principles. It is so far up to each and every organization that is embracing the principles to see how they want to integrate it into their own practices. And some of the organizations, as Fairware, are already used to assessing performance of their brand. So it's logical that we will also do that. Others will have to think about how they measure progress on their members. But it's definitely something that we, as a group of MSIs, want to look at on how to best stimulate the uptake of the process. So some level of transparency is, of course, needed for that to be able to measure progress. So that is still to come. I saw a raised hand as well. I see several raised hands. I saw one from Ruben from FNV.
Thank you, and just thank you, Margreet, for giving me the floor. I'm just typing my question as well. Well, thank you so much for this important initiative. I think there are so many initiatives. It's really mushrooming. It's for brand very difficult also to commit to one initiative or the other. My question has to do to what extent will the common framework apply mandatory minimum standards to the different areas that are covered under the framework to ensure that, well, ESG conditions improve and that you also create an equal level play field for, well, the different brands and other stakeholders?
Yeah. No, that is a really relevant question. And it's also one of the reasons why we work on this, because the way I see it, having this common language on what we understand as responsible purchasing practices, this is also relevant for, as I said, other actors in the industry. So like the finance sector, on how they look at it and how they want to create incentives for the brands that they are financing or supporting financially, but also policymakers. So it's up for use also for discussions with policymakers in the debate on how to use it. On whether, because that's maybe, I see you're nodding as well, and I know there are some questions around this as well. It's up, of course, to each of the organizations to discuss whether they see legislation also as one of the instruments to enhance the uptake of it. So that is something up for discussion, I'd say. It's definitely one of the instruments that can help enhance the uptake of it. We also know, of course, that there is a process on mandatory human rights due diligence legislation in the EU, and there is a link, of course, with responsible purchasing practices there as well. So I think actually having a common framework with wide support of the industry is also useful for those discussions. Questions are coming in both through the chat, and I see some raised hands still. Fiona, you have your hand raised as well.
Thank you very much. And I'm assuming you can see me.
Yeah, we can.
Yeah, so I'm you know, happy that there's a coordination. I think that on the basis of quite a long period of experience, I feel that poor purchasing practices have been known about for, let's say, since the early 2000s at least. So it's not a question in my mind about how to purchase responsibly, but actually that the incentives of the retailers are not aligned to purchase responsibly. And so essentially when retailers are buying in products that are consumer ready for resale, when they miss their profit targets, the place to chase that margin and to recoup it is essentially to squeeze the suppliers. So on all of that, it feels like this is a voluntary approach and it's not going to work. So I think it's got to be complemented, and this is my request to the others in the group, that actually the recommendation is to promote this voluntary guide alongside regulation, because commercial practices have already been regulated in food, and that's made quite a significant difference to the ability of suppliers to be able to plan. What's missing is that there's no regulation in garments. So I think that just voluntary is naive, and it needs to be complemented by regulation. And my request would be that the MSIs plus any others that are on this call support a call for regulation, because otherwise we're just possibly wasting time hoping that this will be sufficient. This has to be complemented. That's my recommendation.
Thanks a lot, Fiona, and it's a clear recommendation for those on the call. As I explained, what we've been working on is the common language, so it's not an approach in itself. There's no recommendation to it whether this should be applied on a voluntary basis or a mandatory basis. It can be used for both, actually, and then speaking the same language. But your call is clear, so an invitation for all of the different organizations present here in this meeting to take up this call and see how to go about it. Tara from ILO, I see you have your hand raised as well.
Excellent. Thank you. And thank you for all the excellent work on this. I know my colleague Juliette has been actively engaged, and we've really appreciated the collaboration along the way. I had a question for you about the integration of the Sustainable Terms of Trade initiative. You had mentioned during the presentation that their white paper, the recommendations in their white paper have been included. And as you said, very good timing came out right as you were finalizing that. Can you talk a little bit about what their engagement moving forward will be, in terms of either, the IAF or the manufacturers directly, and their ability to be able to input into this, or the consultation or engagement process with that initiative in the future? Thank you.
Yeah, sure. Thanks for that question. Indeed, the timing was actually quite positive. As we were about to have a final draft, we could compare notes. And to my positive surprise, we were talking about the same issues. And maybe the wording here and there was a bit different in the first drafts, but closely aligned. So we've been able to actually incorporate almost everything, I'd say. In the beginning, I made a remark about our definition of purchasing practices to really focus at sourcing practices. So there is, to mention one example, a remark on reducing audit fatigue in the recommendations of the Sustainable Terms of Trading initiatives. And I completely agree with that is important. We should go beyond auditing, but that is not included in this common framework as such, because we limit it to purchasing practices. So that's not so much a point of disagreement, but it is one of the differences. Another topic that we spoke about is costing and the wording around open costing, because there is a recommendation within the white paper of the STTI about ceasing open costing, and we completely understand that, because it can be used also to further squeeze suppliers further down the chain. The way we used, and we talk about labor minute costing, for example, as a tool to make sure that proper prices are paid in the end, which allow for living wages being paid, is a bit different, but that is and actually better received also by the STTI group. So what we are doing, both of us, both the MSI Working Group and the Sustainable Terms of Trading Initiative, have indicated that we'd like to continue the dialogue, because there are indeed, now that we have this language, several topics that we both want to discuss further about how to create the best incentives to enhance the uptake. That is an objective of both of us, both SCTI and us, but also how to maybe go about suppliers that are seeing that brands are not following those lines, how to take up that discussion, how to maybe measure progress together, and there can be possibly also a link with what the Industry 1 is organizing on purchasing practices, because the Industry 1, some of you might have seen that, an initiative that is there to not only on purchasing practices, but on different topics, is working on enhancing alignment and accelerating change, has developed an indicator on purchasing practices. And they have partnered with Better Buying on this indicator, and this indicator is giving supplier perspectives on what they feel about the purchasing practices of the brands that buy from them. And that can be a perfect indicator also to measure progress on the uptake of this framework and on the recommendations of the SCTI. And Better Buying, not surprisingly, is involved in both initiatives. So there is a talk that we really like to continue. Let me look at whether I see more raised hand. There are some questions also coming in the chat.
There's two that haven't been answered in the chat. Should I ask them to speak?
Yeah.
So Karen Pybus, do you feel your question's been answered, or would you like to ask your question?
No, I think that's fine. It's been answered. Thank you.
Thank you. And Andre?
Yeah, I had a question because as the discussion goes today in the call, the talk about purchasing practices has been there for a long time, and the OECD event is going to be dedicated to some extent to purchasing practices as well. And we hear about a lot of different regulations, different guidelines, different standards on what purchasing practices needs to be. And I think it's great that the industry is aligning on the language. What do we mean by purchasing practices? But I was wondering, what should brands do when there's such a plethora of different purchasing practices, and some of the brands are already working with purchasing practices? So how does this exercise address the brands that are already working on purchasing practices, have commitments that are already operational and commitments in supported by MOUs with unions and so on? And how do we avoid creating yet another layer of guidance or new purchasing practice agreements or frameworks that can only dilute maybe the overall impact that the industry tries to create? Thank you.
Yeah, and that would be the opposite of what we aim, what we aim for together, of course. So thanks for this question. What we try to do is indeed to start with mapping what is there, and to find, not to water it down to the lowest common denominator, but really to agree on what we see as a good standard of purchasing practices, which ended now up in this common framework. I should say that it is not to be seen as a new instrument that you should report on, but indeed to see how to connect and align on what you are already doing on purchasing practices. So it's really there to help talk the same language with each other and to connect with what you are already doing. So it should not be an extra layer, but really a facilitator of reporting also and talking to others on what you are already doing.
Thank you.
Let me see, are there more questions in the chat that we haven't dealt with yet? There is
no, I think they have been addressed.
Yeah, so Olivia also mentioned the Industry 1. Glad to see you here in this call as well. I already touched a bit upon it. So the Industry 1 is an initiative that started to develop an indicator on purchasing practices to have that indicator as a sort of temperature check or thermometer to check what the status quo of purchasing practices, how suppliers feel about it, but with the purpose, of course, to have everybody develop activities to change that and to improve the performance on it. And I hope the common language that we have written down in the common framework is helpful for the activities that brands and other actors and policymakers can take to make sure that the score on the performance, on the purchasing practices indicator that the industry uses is going up. So there is a last chance, as Olivier indicates in the chat, to make sure suppliers fill in the survey that the industry want together with Better Buying have disseminated, and the results of that will be shared also during the OECD forum, as rightfully indicated by some of you. On that forum, there will be lots of talks about purchasing practices because it is so key. Okay, I think we are close to the end of this this meeting. So let me see if there are some final questions to address. If not, I'd really like to take the opportunity to, first of all, thank everybody who has been engaged in the work of the working groups, and not only the organizations, the MSIs that we've mentioned, but also the other organizations that have provided input, shared their expertise with us. But I'd really like to thank also the team that has worked on preparing this meeting and preparing the presentation. And of course, also thanks to all of you. We have a very high rate of participation, so that pleases us. And that gives us maybe a big task in digesting all the feedback that we hope to receive from you. But that is the reason why we do this. We'd really like to hear your perspective. So you're all invited to discuss it internally within your organization or with your peers, and fill out the survey. And we're really looking forward to your input and your feedback on it. So thanks a lot.